How's it going, guys? In this video we're going to be replacing the screen on a second gen iPhone SE from 2020, and I've already removed the two pentalobe screws on the bottom, and then I used a suction cup to pry up on the screen, and then a little guitar pick to help separate the screen all the way from the actual assembly, the aluminum housing part. And on this one you want to be really careful as you take it off because there are ribbon cables, so if you pull this thing off too quickly or too hard they will tear those, so you just want to be really careful. And then you want to open it up like a book, and you want to prop the screen against something because there will be tension if you let the screen lay completely flat. And so the very first thing you're going to be removing are the two display cables that are attached into the actual phone. There's a bracket held on with four Phillips screws that you need to take off, so just a fine tip Phillips screwdriver on this one, and these screws are different lengths, all four of them, so you want to make sure you remember exactly where each one of them came from. And then after you get these off, you can then take off the actual shield that is securing the cables into the actual main board in the phone. And so in this case I use a little plastic spudger tool as a little way to kind of help separate it from it. And you've got the two cables, so you just gently pull these up from the board, and then once you get those two cables off, the next thing is to actually remove the camera cable from the screen as well. And so to remove that, there's going to be an additional 3 Phillips screws holding on the little metal shield that you will again need to remove prior to removing the actual cable from the board. So you're just going to take those 3 Phillips screws off. In my case, this phone didn't have that third screw, which means someone's been here before, but doesn't matter. So your case, if it's a brand new phone or genuine original phone, you have to remove 3. You get that cable cap off, and then separate it from the board like so, and you can just remove the screen. There may be a little bit of the residue left over from the waterproofing that Apple puts in these things. And you can see a little reflection of my face there. But yeah, so that is the screen that I took out. This one was not a genuine screen, and part of the reason I'm doing this is because I wanted a genuine screen in this phone. And so the other part you're going to need to do is to actually remove the Touch ID sensor from the phone, because the Touch ID transfers only in that same Touch ID sensor itself. You can't buy a replacement one, otherwise you'll run into a lot of issues. These are held in with Y1 screws. These are tiny little screws and very special. You can't just use a Phillips screw on this. It is a Y1 screw that you need to use. I believe it's 0.2 millimeters in size, and for me these screws are kind of hard to get out, especially because the last person who did this job torqued them in really hard and almost stripped them. So like I had to put a fair amount of pressure perpendicularly down and then get them undone. And once we got them undone, I was able to use my little spudger thing to help remove the screws from the actual housing that helps keep the Touch ID sensor into the display assembly. And then with that, there is that little connector right here that you need to remove. So you can't see it on the camera right now, but basically just gently lifting up and then prying it sideways to help separate the two cables from the actual screen and the Touch ID sensor. And then once you got that cable removed, there is adhesive on the bottom of it, so you want to be really careful with this thing, because if you tear that ribbon cable, you're basically not going to have Touch ID because you can't replace those Touch ID buttons. And then you basically just thread in the new one, and sometimes it might be a little bit tricky, like in this case it just falls out, but you gotta put it back into the new housing or the new assembly that you'll be doing. And then from there you want to reattach the actual connector from the Touch ID sensor into the actual display. And that's something, again, apologize, isn't on camera, but you just want to make sure you gently get those pins aligned and then press them together, and you want to hear that click. If you don't, it means it's not applied correctly. And then just basically reattaching that display assembly with those 3 Y1 screws that Apple loves using that I really don't like. So there's, I believe, 4 in total, and they're all the same length, so you just put them back in the same way you took them out. And you need to do this, because if you don't do this, when your phone turns back on, the screen will turn on fine, but it will not be able to recognize the Touch ID. So just gently make sure you go through this. And yeah, so this video is also played at 4x speed, so this job took me half an hour to do. And so that's how much time I would expect a reasonably novice person to take. Now comes the time to actually start reattaching the cables into display assembly. I had a little bit of trouble with the actual camera / speaker cable here, so like it's hard to make sure you're aligning the pins right, because you don't want to squash it and like ruin the pins on the connector, because otherwise you have to buy a new screen. So just making sure you align it right and you feel that little click when those things all press down. is really important. And also testing the phone afterwards, make sure you still have a working microphone and front-facing camera is a good test to do after you do this job. And then you're just screwing back in that little metal housing with your 3 Phillips screws. In my case, one of them had been lost, but it's not the end of the world. So basically, yeah, just getting those 3 Phillips screws threaded back in to secure the actual connector onto the assembly. And again, making sure that you're not stressing those cables. So I have that little box to the left of the phone right now to just hold up the screen while I figure out how to properly fix those cables into that board on the phone. And so in this case, once we get all that stuff done, just reattach that metal bracket, and this is the part that has those 4 Phillips screws that are all different sizes, so make sure you remember where each one of them went. I believe the longest one is the one on the far outside, and then you've got the 2 outer ones on the bottom are the small ones, and then there's one in the middle that is a bit longer too. So that's how you thread that back in with those 4 Phillips screws. And then once you get this, I just make sure I torque down everything, and then I close the lid on this. I don't close it all the way, and you want to hold down the power button, make sure that this phone is still able to turn on okay. And if it is, and you're able to make sure the touchscreen's working, test the front-facing camera and the microphone, and see if it's all good. And after you've done that, you can then attach the 2 pentalobe screws back into the housing. And then once you do this, you should be good to go. And thank you all for watching.